On this video, I'm going to tell you about the most frequently tested UCC sections. I have two caveats I want to call to your attention. Number one, you must actually get out your UCC book and read these UCC sections, okay? Don't rely on the little bit of information that I'm going to tell you about here. This is the critical stuff, so you'll know something about it, but read it, okay? It's important. When you get to the multiple choice part of the exam, they may test some much more subtle aspect of these UCC code sections, so please read them. The second caveat is that the section on page 73 of the What to Write book, there is a list of the most frequently tested UCC sections, and it's got about 5 or 6 more sections which are not here. Please look at that list and read those also. Let's start through these. Number 1, merchant, 2-104. You do not need to memorize the code section numbers. If you do, fine, use them, but that's not required. But you do need to know what it says. 2-104 defines merchant. Now, merchant comes up in a number of places in the UCC. There are a number of places where if the transaction is between merchants, that means both parties must be merchants. If it's between merchants, there are some rules that apply that don't apply unless both parties are merchants. For example, 2-201 subsection 2 is the section that says, if I am a merchant and I send you a written confirmation of our oral contract, and you are a merchant and you receive it, that even though you don't respond, that if you receive it, had reason to know of the contacts you got, reason to know of the contents of what I sent to you, and you don't have to read it, you received it within a reasonable time, and you don't object within 10 days, then you are bound even though you didn't sign anything. And that's tested frequently, but we have to both be merchants in order for that section to be applicable. Now, when they test this, the bar examiners will frequently make it obvious that one of the parties is a merchant, but for both of them to be a merchant, if you want both parties to be a merchant, the second party, there'll be some problem where you have to do a little bit of work to show that this other person is a merchant. So you need to know the definition of a merchant, and I'll give those to you now. They are located here at UCC 2-104, and at 2-104 it says that there are 3 ways to be a merchant. And the 3 ways to be a merchant located in that section are, number 1, one who deals in goods of the kind. Now, deals in goods of the kind means that I buy them and I sell them. That's dealing in goods of the kind. Or I manufacture them and I sell them. That's dealing in goods of the kind. Now, so that's one way to be a merchant. If I deal in, I have a local stationery store where I deal in paper and pencils and that sort of thing, and I'm buying or selling a car, I'm not a merchant in cars. Okay, got to be one who deals in goods of the kind involved in this transaction. So that's one way to be a merchant. The second way to be a merchant is to be one who claims expertise, specialized knowledge in the type of goods involved in this transaction, or even specialized knowledge about the type of transaction. So for example, if I am an automobile mechanic, as my occupation, it's got to be my occupation, not my hobby. If I race cars on the weekend as a hobby, that's not my occupation. But if by my occupation I'm an automobile mechanic by day, and I want to sell you my car, and we enter into a deal about the selling of my car to you, I will be treated as a merchant, because by my occupation I claim to have specialized knowledge about those kind of goods. That's a second way to be a merchant, one who by his or her occupation claims to have specialized knowledge about these kinds of goods, cars in my example. There's a third way to be a merchant. The third way to be a merchant is if I want to sell my car and I'm not a mechanic, but I hire a mechanic to represent me in the sale of this car, or I hire a mechanic to represent me in the purchase of the car. Then the rule is that this third way to be a merchant is if I employ an intermediary who by that person's occupation, that person claims to have specialized knowledge, then I am the principal now. I will be treated as a merchant if I hire this intermediary who claims by occupation, not hobby, to have that specialized knowledge. So those are the three ways to be a merchant. And again, when there are lots of sections in the UCC, first of all, I hope everyone understands, does not require that anyone should be a merchant in order for the UCC to apply. The UCC applies if the transaction is in goods as opposed to services or real estate or something. But if I want to sell you this marker for 10 cents, and neither one of us is marker experts or merchants in markers or merchants at all, the UCC still applies. So I meet you on the street corner and say, would you like to buy this for 10 cents? UCC applies. But there are some sections of the UCC where it specifically requires that one party be a merchant, or maybe both parties should be a merchant. For example, 2-205, the firm offer rule, says a merchant can make a firm offer, but a non-merchant cannot. And so that's a section where one party needs to be a merchant. So you understand how that works. So 2-104 defines merchants. There are three ways to be a merchant. Let me give you one more example about this merchant thing. Let me suppose that I am dealing, let's take General Motors. General Motors is a merchant in cars. We all know that. They make cars and they sell them. But General Motors, if suppose they are buying a large quantity of paint from some paint company. Let's suppose that General Motors doesn't mix its own paint, it buys it from someplace. So if General Motors is going to buy a large quantity of paint from someone, if General Motors now is the buyer and the paint manufacturer is the seller, well, the paint manufacturer is obviously a merchant because they manufacture and sell. So they deal in goods of the kind. But is General Motors, who's buying 1 million gallons of paint, are they a merchant in paint? And the answer is, well, wait a minute now. General Motors does not deal in paints. They don't sell paint. So they're not a merchant for reason number one. Number two, does General Motors, by its occupation, claim to have specialized knowledge about paint? Well, General Motors doesn't have an occupation. People have occupations, corporations don't. And thirdly, has General Motors hired somebody? Do they have an intermediary who, by that person's occupation, claims to have specialized knowledge in paint? And the answer is yes. General Motors, you can be assured, has got somebody on their staff that's their paint expert. And that person, by that person's occupation, claims to have specialized knowledge about paint. And that would make General Motors a merchant in paints for that third reason. Next, 2-201, statute of frauds. Big deal, tested a lot. There are two sections which are tested frequently, subsection 1 and subsection 2. Subsection 1, first of all, please actually read it. Okay, that's important. Actually read it. Subsection 1 says that a contract for the sale of goods for the price of $500 or more. Now be careful, because we're talking about the price of the item being sold, not the value of it. So if I'm offering you this marker for $500 or more, forgetting about the fact that you may be crazy to buy it for that price, If I'm offering you this marker for $500 or more, and we form a contract about this, then we need a writing, because in order for that contract to be enforceable. Now, of course, if I offer you the marker for $500 and you pay me the $500 and the deal is all over, well, that's a completed transaction. The statute of frauds doesn't apply to the completed transaction and doesn't apply to the part of the current transaction that's already been completed. So if I offer you these two markers for $500 and we have a contract, we have an oral contract where you're buying these two markers from me for $500, I deliver one and you accept the delivery of that one, well, and then when I try to collect, you say, gee, Emerson, the contract was not in writing, statute of frauds, I don't have to pay you for the one you delivered. And the answer is that under the so-called part performance doctrine in contracts, now be careful, there's also a part performance doctrine in real property. We're talking about the part performance doctrine in contracts. And it says the part of the contract which has been performed and accepted. So I delivered you one of these markers and you accepted it, that the part of the contract that's been performed and accepted by the other side is no longer subject to the statute of frauds. So when you say you don't want to pay me because it doesn't work, because the statute of frauds doesn't apply. Now, when I ship the goods to you and they arrived at your place and you said you don't want them, okay, now that's different because you didn't accept them. But the part of the contract which has been performed and accepted is no longer subject to the statute of frauds. So you'd have to pay for the one that you accepted, but the other one that I haven't delivered to you yet, the statute of frauds applies, it's unenforceable, that part of the contract remains unenforceable. Now, and so we were talking about statute of frauds, and we're saying that at 2-201 subsection 1, it says a contract for the sale of goods. We know what goods are. Goods are movable, tangible, personal property. The contract for the sale of goods for the price of $500 or more. Please notice that it doesn't say for more than $500. It says for the price of $500 or more. Okay, so it starts at $499.99. You can do it oral. For $500 or more, you need the writing in order for the contract to be enforceable, but the part of the contract that's already been performed and accepted is no longer subject to the statute of frauds. There's 2-201, please read the whole thing. It also has some other important things in there. The writing that you needs to show intent to contract and quantity. Doesn't have to have the price. Does have to have time for performance. It does have to show intent to contract and quantity. If it also points out that if there is a mistake in the writing, I typed the contract wrong, that even though there is a mistake in the writing, that writing can still be used to satisfy the statute of frauds. Now, what you do about the mistake is different. You may, for example, the court may reform the document to conform to the intent of the parties. So if we had a contract for 90 cents a pound for some bolts, and I typed 91 cents, that doesn't change our oral contract. I just typed it badly. And the courts will enforce the contract at the 90 cents, will reform the 91 to read what we intended. That's subsection 1. And then subsection 2, 2-201 subsection 2 is also frequently tested. And the way it is frequently tested is what happens is that you and I are both merchants. Now for 2-201 subsection 2 to apply, both parties have to be merchants. For subsection 1 to apply, nobody needs to be a merchant. But for subsection 2, both parties need to be merchants. This is the case where you and I form a contract on the telephone, and it's for the sale of goods for the price of $500 or more, so we need a writing, but the contract doesn't have a writing yet. But now, if we are both merchants, that's a whole bunch of little requirements now to this subsection 2. Let me tell you about them. I want you to read it, please, but I'm going to tell you about most of them. It says, if both parties are merchants, and you might have to prove that, and if I send you a written confirmation, and you receive it within a reasonable time, that's another requirement. You actually received it and you got it within a reasonable time, and what I sent to you was sufficient to bind me, so that I am bound by the writing which I sent to you, and you have reason to know of the contents of the writing. You don't have to actually read it, but if you don't get letters from me all the time or emails from me all the time or something, then you have reason to know of the contents. And finally, if you do not object within 10 days of when you got it, if you got the written confirmation from me and you send me objection within 10 days, send it. I don't have to get it within 10 days. You send me objection within 10 days, then then you're not bound. But if you don't, if you meet all the requirements that I just listed, and you do not object within 10 days, then you are bound just as though you signed it, even though you didn't sign anything, so long as we're both merchants and all those other requirements are met. That's 2-201 subsection 2. This is frequently tested, so please know it. Next one is 2-201 sub 207 subsections 1 and 2. 2-207, I know that you are familiar with it, but let me summarize for you what it's about. 2-201, 207, pardon me. 2-207 is about the mirror image rule. Now, you know at common law, if I make you an offer, that you have to, if you're going to accept it all, you can only accept exactly the offer that I made to you. Okay, you can't slice out certain parts of it or accept it and add new parts or anything of that sort. The mirror image rule, you must accept exactly what I offered to you or nothing. Now, of course, you can reject what I sent you and make a counteroffer. You can do that. But, so those are the only choices you have at common law. You can accept the offer I made, or you can reject it and make a counteroffer, or you can just reject it altogether and not even make a counteroffer. Now, if, for example, I send you an offer and you say, I accept on the condition that you, Emerson, do something else. Well, that's a conditional acceptance, and that really amounts to a rejection and a counteroffer. So once again, this is very important because this comes up in bar questions all the time. I say to you, I offer to do so-and-so. I offer to sell you my car. And you respond, I accept, but on the condition that you put new tires on it. Or I accept only if you put new tires. Or I accept if you lower the price. Or I accept any kind of a condition of that sort. And so if you put a condition on there, meaning that you accept provided I do something else or some other event takes place, if that's your acceptance, that's a conditional acceptance, which is a rejection and counteroffer. Now, the UCC at 2-207 subsection 1 does something with that mirror image rule. It says that when you accept, that you can, in fact, accept and propose some additional or different terms. Now, proposing an additional or different term is different from you accept on the condition that I perform this new term. You say, you accept, but only if I put new tires on the car. You accept, but only if I deliver it to your place. So that's a conditional acceptance that puts a burden back on me. And when you put that burden back on me, that's really a counteroffer, rejection and a counteroffer. But that is different from the case where you say, I offer to sell you my car. You say, you accept, but would I please deliver it to your place? Would I please put some new tires on it? You propose that I paint it before delivering it to you. You would like for me to sweep to wash it before I deliver it to you. So these things are all proposals for additions to the contract, or they are proposals for something that's different, meaning different from, a contradict my offer. When I offer to sell you my car at a price, and you say you accept and you would like for me to put new tires on, that's not contradicting my offer. But if I make an offer and you say something, you accept, but you propose something that contradicts some term of my offer, that's still just a proposal. If you say you accept only if I agree to that, that's a rejection and counteroffer. So that's a fine distinction, but you have to make that distinction between when I offer that you either accept conditionally, which is a rejection and counteroffer, or you accept but you propose some additional terms. And what 2-207 subsection 1 says is that if you accept and you propose additional terms or different terms contradicting my offer, that's still a good acceptance. Okay? You accept, you propose, it's still a good acceptance. Whereas if you accept on a condition, that a conditional acceptance, that's not a good acceptance. And you have to wait for me to agree to do whatever you said. You said you accept provided I put new tires on the car. Well, you got to wait to see if I agree to that before you know if we have a contract or not. So 2-201, 2-207, I don't know why I keep saying that. 2-207 subsection 1 is the section that deals with what I just told you about. It helps you determine whether or not you do or do not have a valid acceptance. An acceptance with a proposal for addition or different terms is still a good acceptance. An acceptance that is conditional is not a good acceptance. Now, sticking with 2-201, a little bit longer here, there is one other thing that's contained there that's important. And that other thing is this, that at 2-207 subsection 1, it deals with this problem. Let's suppose that you and I have, I make an offer to you and you say, I accept, and this is all over the telephone, so it's oral. So you say, I accept, so we've got an offer and acceptance. And now I send you a written confirmation to what we just agreed to on the telephone. Now I send you this written confirmation, and now be careful, a few minutes ago we were talking about whether or not this written confirmation is going to bind you so far as the statute of frauds is concerned. And if we are both merchants and all that sort of stuff, you may end up being bound even though you didn't sign anything. But I'm not talking about the statute of frauds now. I'm talking about the written confirmation, and I'm going to add some additional terms in my written confirmation, or a different contradictory term in the written confirmation. So if I send you a written confirmation, or you send me a written confirmation, the written confirmation may contain proposals for additional terms or proposals for different contradictory terms. And the 2-207 subsection 1 says that's okay if the written confirmation has these proposals for addition or different terms. That's perfectly okay, and you still got a good acceptance. Now, so that's what 2-207 subsection 1 says. 2-207 subsection 2 tells you what to do with this proposal for additional terms. So if I make a proposal to you to sell you my car, and then you answer and you propose additional or different terms, what happens to the proposal? We have a contract because we have an offer and acceptance. We have agreement on the terms because I made the offer, you accepted with a proposal for additional terms, not a conditional acceptance. And so so we now have an agreement on the essential terms, but we have an agreement, but we have your proposal for additional or different terms. What happens to that proposal? Do the terms of that proposal end up in the contract or not in the contract? That's what we want to know. And that's what subsection 2 does for us. Subsection 2 answers that question. Subsection 2 says that says if you and I are both merchants, if we are both, and only if we are both merchants, then the proposed additions to the contract will end up in the contract. They'll automatically be in the contract unless First of all, three things. One is that I said to you when I made the offer that don't propose any additional terms. I'm telling you in advance that I'm rejecting them all. In that case, the proposals for additional terms will not end up in the contract. Secondly, the second way they will not be there is if I object to them within a reasonable time, not 10 days, reasonable time. The 10 days went with 2-201 subsection 2. The 10 days is here. Here it's reasonable time. So the second way the proposals for additional terms will not be in the contract is if I object within a reasonable time. So far we have two reasons they won't end up there. One is I told you in advance, don't even put them there because I'm rejecting them in advance. The other is when I get your proposals, I reject them. And the third way that your proposal for addition to the contract will not end up in the contract is if your proposal materially alters the contract. If it materially alters the contract. You're proposing something that's so substantial that it's a material alteration. Obviously, there's room for debate here as to whether or not your proposal is a material alteration or not. And when this happens on the bar, you are expected to make an argument both ways, that it is and is not a material alteration. So that's what 2-201, 207 subsection 1 and 2 say. 2-209 has 5 sections to it. It's important to read them all, but I'm going to talk about subsection 1 and subsection 3 right now. Subsection 1, 2-209 subsection 1 says that the modification of a contract does not require consideration. Modification does not require consideration. Now, the modification needs to be in good faith. It can't be in bad faith. Way back at the early beginnings of the UCC, section 1-204, it says everything in this UCC requires good faith. And so if you and I have a contract and one of us wants to modify it, it doesn't require any consideration, but does require good faith. That's 2-209 subsection 1. Subsection 3 deals with the statute of frauds for modifications. It says that for modifications, if the contract as modified would have required a writing if you had started there, then the modification needs to be in writing. Once again, if the contract as modified, meaning after you put the modification into effect, if you end up with a contract which would have required a writing if you had started there, then that modification needs to be written. For example, I'm going to sell you my car for $300. Contract can be oral. I put new tires on it and in good faith say, I now want $700 for the car. Well, that's a good faith modification, offer of a modification. If you accept it, the problem now is that I'm now selling you my car for $700. That requires a writing. And so the modification from $300 to $700 needs a writing. If I had done it the other way around, I started with a contract for $700, and now we modified down to $300 because I had an accident in the car. We end up with a contract for $300, and therefore that modification does not need to be in writing. Suppose we started with the sale of a car for $700 and I modified to $800. We need a writing because we ended up at $800. Suppose we started at $1,000 and I modified to $600. We need a writing for the modification. Notice this has nothing to do with whether or not you needed the original contract in writing. Okay, the rule does not depend on that. There's an earlier common law rule that did it that way, but that's not the way the UCC does it, and most common law jurisdictions do not do it that way. The general rule is you look at where you ended up. If you ended up in a place where you would have needed a writing if you had started there, then that modification needs to be in writing. Next comes 2-305. 2-305 says you can form a contract even though the price is to be determined later. A lot of common law rules may not let you do that. Price is so essential. In the UCC, price can be determined later. You can have a contract without the price. 2-306 is about output and requirement contracts. 2-306, output and requirements contracts. This is the case where normally you need the quantity, even under the UCC, where you are forming, under 2-201, if you're forming a contract for the sale of goods and it needs to be in writing, one of the few things you have to have in that writing is quantity. I think I said a few minutes ago you needed intent to contract, and I think I said quantity, I hope I did, but you need intent to contract and quantity in order to have a sufficient writing. But under the, if you have a requirements or output contract, you have a problem with the quantity. Let me tell you about that. I run a factory, and in my factory, I make bicycles. And you make a deal with me where you will buy, you offer to buy, we make a contract, where you are going to buy my entire output, all of my output of bicycles for the next year or something. So you're going to buy my entire output of contracts, of bicycles, and so what's the quantity? Maybe we have a price, you're going to buy them at a certain price, but what's the quantity? Well, my entire output is not a fixed number. And at common law, you couldn't have contracts like that unless I had been in business for a while and we had a pretty good fix on what the quantity was. So I had to have an established business, so we had a very good estimate of the quantity. Modernly, that's not the way that works anymore. 2-306 says that if we have an output contract like that, that the output, the quantity term should be, and please actually read it. The quantity term is, first, if we agreed on an estimation, then anything that isn't, disproportionately different from that estimation would be okay. So anything reasonably close to what we estimated is okay. If we didn't estimate, then my prior output, whatever I've been doing in the past, anything reasonably like that is okay. And if we don't even have that, then you just have to look to reasonableness. Now, so for output contracts, you don't have a quantity term, but it's handled in the way that I just mentioned. And if I try to differ, if I am operating my bicycle factory and you're going to buy all the output, and once I find out you're going to buy all the output, I go, hot dog, I'm going to triple my output. I'm going to have a 3-shift operation, a day shift and a swing shift and a midnight shift, graveyard shift, so I can have 3 times as many bicycles, and you still got to buy them all. And the rule is, well, you don't have to buy them all because the quantity differs too much from what we had agreed upon. Now, from what your expectations were. There's also the requirements contract, a little different from the output contract. The requirements contract occurs in the case where you have a retail bicycle store. And in your retail bicycle store, you sell bicycles, and you need a source of supply from me. I manufacture bicycles. And you make a deal with me where I promise you to supply all the bicycles that you require in your business. All the bicycles that you require. Well, once again, if I'm going to supply all the bicycles that you require, the quantity is not there, but the quantity is controlled by those things I told you about. Any estimates that we made and reasonable expectations based on the past. And so the quantity is controlled in that way for the requirements contract also, where I'm going to supply all the bicycles you require in your business. Now please notice, if I say I'm going to supply all the bicycles that you would like to have, okay, that doesn't have any controls, and that's not enforceable. But if I say I'm going to supply all the bicycles you need in your business, you require in your business, that has some controls and the rule, and it's okay. So we can have requirements contracts, output contracts, even though the quantity is not quite fixed. And the last thing I want to tell you about these requirements and output contracts is that where is the consideration? That is to say, if I run the bicycle factory, you're going to buy my entire output, and I promise to sell you my entire output. Where is the consideration? See, if I sell you one bike and you pay me money, well, you got consideration. It's not a problem. It's a bargain. But in the case of the output, you have to recognize that the consideration is as follows. If I'm going to sell you my entire output, then I have incurred a legal detriment because I can't sell any of my bicycles to anybody else, even if they want to pay me a better price for it. And so I've incurred a legal detriment in that I've promised not to sell them to anybody else. So that's consideration. I suffered that. And you have incurred a legal detriment because you have to buy all of my bicycles. Before we made this deal, you didn't have to buy any of my bicycles, let alone all of them. So now you got to buy them all. And secondly, I can't sell to anybody else. And that's the consideration on both sides. In the case of the requirements contract, there's also consideration on both sides, because in that case, I am now obligated to supply all the bicycles you require. Well, in supplying you with all the bicycles you require, I didn't used to have to do that. But now I do, so I've incurred a legal detriment. Your legal detriment, you're operating the retail bicycle store, your legal detriment is that you have to promise to buy exclusively from me. You can't buy from anybody else, even if you can get a better deal from somebody else. So we both have incurred consideration, and you need to know that because that often comes up on the exam also. That takes care of the requirements and output contracts. 2-609, adequate assurances, simply says that if we have a contract where you are supplying goods to me and I have reason to believe that you may not be able to supply these goods. There's a strike at your factory. There was a fire at your factory. There was an earthquake, and I think your factory may have been partly damaged. I hear that you may be going bankrupt. So if I have any reasonable commercial reasons to believe that you may not be able to supply me with, to sell me the goods you're supposed to sell me, then I can, if I have any reasons to believe that you may not be able to do that, I can demand in writing, I have to put this in writing, I can demand further assurances from you. That's what 609 says. I can demand further assurances from you, and these further assurances are basically you have to provide me with commercially reasonable assurances that you will be able to perform. Doesn't say it has to be in writing. Whatever is commercially reasonable under the circumstances, that you have to provide me with that. If you don't provide me with commercially reasonable assurances that you will be able to perform within a reasonable time not to exceed 30 days, reasonable time not to exceed 30 days, then I can treat it as a breach. And finally, 2-610, anticipatory repudiation, simply says that if repudiation means words, you use words to say I'm not going to do it. So you repudiate with words. So if you use words to tell me that you're not going to perform the contract, that's a repudiation. And that's a breach of contract. Even though if you tell me you're not going to perform, I can call you up and beg you to perform and say I'll wait for you and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't change my right to treat it as a breach of contract. So these are the most frequently tested UCC sections. Please actually read them and read the others which are found on page 73 of the What to Write book. And if you do that, you will be much better off in terms of the multiple choice as well as the essay part, because these things are tested. If they're about half of the questions, the essay questions are UCC questions, And that means that you be almost guaranteed that some of these code sections on the board will be tested in that case. And that's the end of this video.